when we talk about voting in this country. The Supreme Court has recently made had a ruling that is going to could potentially or has seriously debilitated the Voting Rights Act, and particularly the disparate impact elements of Section 2. But there are other areas in which our government over the years has been involved, which has created disparate impact. And one of those, of course, has to deal with the backing of mortgages and the so-called redlining that we saw in the early parts of the 20th century. And joining us now is Garrett Nelson. He is the curator of maps and director of geographic scholarship at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Public Library in Boston. And Garrett has revisited that dynamic of redlining and found some very interesting things. Garrett, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sam.
So, all right, let's just go with, I mean, to the extent that this is common knowledge, which I frankly don't think it is. Never mind your intervention into this dynamic, our understanding of it. I don't think the dynamic in and of itself is really widely known. And so let's start with that, the sort of more conventional wisdom or knowledge of this dynamic where the U.S. government was basically involved in building or, I guess, creating a certain stagnation within neighborhoods around the country. Walk us through that.
Sure. So, Sam, as I think many people probably still know, American cities are enormously segregated by race in terms of their spatial dynamics. People across races don't live evenly across different neighborhoods in almost any American city. And so historians, sociologists, others have probed this question. Why is it that American cities are so spatially divided and segregated this way, even long after the formal mechanisms of segregation have ceased? And there's what is becoming a fairly notorious and well-known set of maps that point to one of these stories. We call these maps redlining maps because of a particular kind of red color which appears on them. And the redlining maps date back to the 1930s when the federal government began to involve itself in mortgage and home lending programs. Those maps have become notorious in recent years because of some important popularization of this history pointing at the federal government's role in racial segregation. So Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations, was actually one of the ones that popularized a kind of historical understanding of redlining and of the way that the federal government used its powers in order to keep the races separate in the modern city.
And we should say that that wealth in this country anyways, although I would imagine in many countries, but particularly in this country, is a very often, broadly speaking, a function of intergenerational wealth that is passed down. And the primary vehicle for most Americans in creating intergenerational wealth has been housing. This has been the key instrument in which families build wealth, and the implications, I think, of having that wealth permeate just about every single conversation you have in this country about anything. Even the question of student debt is so tied into family and intergenerational wealth that it's impossible to sort of even assess the program without being aware of the question of wealth rather than just looking at income. And so these redlining maps in 1930, I mean, put us into some like historical perspective here. We are in 1930, we're only 60 some odd years out from the end of the Civil War. You have, all of these cities are filled with either former slaves or children of former slaves, and so let's just start with that first segregation. Was the segregation there explicit? Is that created this dynamic?
So just to back up briefly to echo your point, for middle-class American families, basically since the middle of the 20th century, assets in primary residences, so that's the value of your home, the place that you live, has been by far the most important chunk of kind of middle-class wealth building, right? Trillions and trillions of dollars in the United States of individual savings are invested in their own homes. And of course, the value of those homes is very closely tied to geography, right? We know that a house in Manhattan costs a lot different from a house in Des Moines, and even two houses in Des Moines in different neighborhoods cost different amounts, not necessarily just based on whether they have a fancy kitchen or not, but because of what neighborhood they're in, right? So there's a reciprocal relationship between the value of a neighborhood and a place, the value of the homes in that neighborhood, and then the assets that the families that own those homes have and are able to pass down through the generations. Now, if you wind back to the 1930s, of course, the 30s are most famous for being the decade of the Great Depression. And it's a time when the federal government was starting to intervene in the kind of broad scale of the American economy in a way that it never had before. So these redlining maps were actually created as a mechanism for the federal government to step in and stabilize housing markets that were going haywire during the Depression, at a time when finance was in free fall, more and more difficult to secure mortgages. These redlining maps were a mechanism that the federal government had set up in order to make mortgages easier to get and in order to allow the federal government to insure those mortgages. Now, what most people understand, or what has become the kind of pat story about these redlining maps, is that the federal government found the non-white neighborhoods, it marked them in red, and it refused to lend in those neighborhoods. And that is a hugely important part of what was going on in this story. The federal government did, in fact, consider race in its evaluation of neighborhoods, making these maps. Race was one of the factors that could mark a neighborhood as uninvestable or uninsurable. And so in doing so, it took these neighborhoods, which were already segregated by other means, both formal Jim Crow segregation, right? We're still in the high period of Jim Crow by the 1930s, but other mechanisms such as residential deed restrictions, which actually made it illegal to sell or transfer property to somebody who was non-white. And then just the sort of generalized racial terror of that persists in the American city today, of keeping people in their places, in their own neighborhoods. So when these redlining maps were made in the 1930s, that spatial segregation of the city was already in place. And the federal government, in making these maps, kind of hardened it, right? It made it legitimate. It codified those racial categories into the colors that we see on the map. But what's interesting is that it's not just race that is shown on these maps. And that's where this kind of popular understanding of the redlining maps from the 1930s as simply being maps of racial segregation are a little bit, it requires a little bit more of a complicated understanding of what was going on to make sense of what was happening.
Yeah, and this is, the importance of this is not to diminish the long history of racism, institutional and governmental racism, but to suggest there's also an interplay between racism and class in this country that is often reinforcing in some ways and performs a certain dance. And what I found interesting about this too is we speak of Jim Crow. During this era, this is at the tail end of, or I should say, of at least the innovation of these laws to suppress black vote, would often, very often, also end up suppressing the vote of poor white people at the same time. It's not exactly the same dynamic, but there is a relationship between these endeavors that inevitably seem to service a wealthy class of people. Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.